Manchester United have just hit a major roadblock in the race for Lewis Hall. Newcastle have reportedly told United he is not for sale. But here's where things get interesting. United may already have a plan B from Spain, and this could completely change their left-back transfer strategy. So who is the new target? Is the Hall deal really dead? And what does Arsenal's latest $75 million move have to do with United? Stay with us because the answer could change everything. Newcastle have reportedly told Manchester United that Lewis Hall is not for sale this summer. That single line has changed the direction of one of United's most closely followed transfer stories. According to Sky Sports, Newcastle have rejected an initial Manchester United inquiry for Lewis Hall and have made their position clear. They do not want to sell the 21-year-old this summer. For weeks, Hall was viewed as United's most realistic route to solving a growing problem at left-back. That route has now hit a wall, and a new name from Spain is entering the conversation. At the same time, Arsenal's activity in the market and a major decision from Vinicius Jr are reshaping the wider picture across the Premier League. Here is everything currently known. Before going further, it's worth understanding why this position matters so much right now. United's left-back options have narrowed significantly this summer. With Tyrell Malacia leaving, Luke Shaw is currently the only senior recognized option in that position. Shaw has also dealt with recurring fitness issues over recent seasons, which makes the absence of a second recognized option even more pressing for a club preparing for a full Premier League campaign plus domestic cup competitions. That leaves the club exposed heading into a long season, and it explains why Hall became such a priority target in the first place. The situation has forced United's recruitment team to widen their search beyond a single name, which is precisely why alternatives from outside the Premier League have entered the conversation this summer. If you're following every twist of this transfer window, this is exactly the kind of story Final Whiz covers daily. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and drop a comment below with your take on whether United should keep chasing Hall or move on. Your input shapes what gets covered next. Hall had been one of United's long-term targets since earlier in the year, and the reasoning behind the interest is straightforward. He's 21 years old, already has Premier League experience, and has shown the ability to operate in more advanced positions when needed. Those attributes made him a natural fit for a club searching for both immediate cover and long-term value at left-back, rather than a short-term patch on a persistent problem. His profile also fits a broader pattern in United's recent recruitment, which has leaned toward younger players with resale value and multiple seasons of development ahead of them. But Newcastle's latest stance forces United into a decision. Do they continue pushing for a player their opponents have already declared unavailable, or do they redirect their resources toward a target who can actually be signed this summer? Prolonged pursuits of players who are publicly declared unavailable can also affect a club's other transfer priorities, since resources and time spent chasing one deal are resources not spent finalizing another. According to the latest reporting, an alternative has already emerged, and it comes from Spain. Football 365 reports that Manchester United are reportedly willing to activate Jorge Salinas' release clause at Racing Santander. The Spanish left-back is also attracting interest from Atletico Madrid, while United are reportedly considering him as an alternative after the difficulty of getting Hall out of Newcastle. This route carries a clear practical advantage. Instead of negotiating with a club that has already stated a player is not for sale, activating a release clause allows United to move on their own timeline, rather than waiting on Newcastle to change position. A release clause also reduces the risk of uncertainty that comes with prolonged transfer negotiations, since the fee is fixed rather than subject to back-and-forth bidding. It also reduces the risk of a rival club intervening late in the process, which becomes a real concern given Atletico Madrid's parallel interest in the same player. Salinas is not the only name being discussed either. There is also reported interest in Antonee Robinson from Fulham, giving United a second option should the Salinas move not materialize. Robinson brings Premier League experience of his own, having established himself as a regular starter in England, which would reduce the adaptation period compared to a signing arriving from a foreign league.
That raises an important question. Is Hall completely out of reach? Not necessarily. Sky Sports analysis suggests United still believe Hall could potentially be achievable because of Newcastle's circumstances. The reasoning behind that belief is specific. Newcastle have no Champions League football, they have changed manager, and several players have already moved on. Those factors could, in theory, shift Newcastle's position later in the window, particularly if the club's priorities change once other business is finalized. But belief and reality are two different things. Newcastle's public stance remains unchanged. Hall is not for sale. And United can't afford to spend the rest of the summer waiting to find out if that changes. Every week spent pursuing a player who is currently unavailable is a week not spent finalizing a deal for a target who could be signed immediately, which is exactly the calculation United's recruitment staff now have to make. There's a separate development that could make the Hall pursuit even harder, and it centers on Newcastle's other prized asset, Bruno Guimaraes. Football 365 reports that Arsenal have agreed a deal worth around £75 million for the Newcastle midfielder. If this transfer is completed, it represents one of the biggest midfield deals of the summer anywhere in the Premier League. For United, the concern is less about Bruno himself and more about what a fee of that size does to Newcastle's financial position. Newcastle would receive a huge fee, and that could potentially give them more financial strength to resist selling other important players. In other words, a deal that has nothing to do with United directly could still make it harder for them to eventually land Hall, since Newcastle would have far less financial pressure to sell. A fee of £75 million also strengthens Newcastle's position under Premier League profit and sustainability regulations, giving the club more flexibility to retain the squad it wants to build around, rather than being forced into further sales before the market closes. While all of this unfolds around Newcastle, Arsenal have also been dealing with a separate story involving one of the biggest names in world football. Vinicius Jr. has decided to stay at Real Madrid. According to the BBC, the Brazilian superstar has signed a new contract at the Bernabeu until 2032, despite interest from Arsenal. This detail matters because of how close Arsenal were reportedly coming to making a move. Arsenal were reportedly prepared to make Vinicius their primary attacking target if he became available. That possibility is now closed. Real Madrid's ability to retain one of the most sought-after attackers in the sport highlights a pattern that has repeated across recent transfer windows. Financial power alone does not guarantee that Premier League clubs can compete for the very biggest names when a club like Real Madrid offers Champions League history and global platform on top of a competitive contract. A contract running till 2032 signals that Real Madrid consider Vinicius a central part of their squad planning for close to a decade, removing him from the market for the foreseeable future, regardless of what any Premier League club is willing to offer. Bringing this back to Manchester United, the current transfer picture makes one point clear. The club cannot rely on one transfer target. Hall remains admired within the club, but Newcastle's rejection means United need a workable alternative rather than a prolonged standoff. Jorge Salinas is now the name most closely linked to a release clause move, with Antonee Robinson also on the radar as a second option. The midfield situation, tied to how the Bruno Guimaraes deal plays out, remains a separate factor worth monitoring, since a completed Arsenal deal changes Newcastle's financial calculations more broadly. United's recruitment approach across this window has also shown a pattern worth noting, a willingness to move for value and availability, rather than waiting indefinitely on a single preferred name, which is consistent with how the Salinas interest has developed, even while Hall remains admired. The stakes around this decision are significant heading into the new season. The worst possible scenario would be entering the new season with Luke Shaw as the only senior left back and hoping injuries don't become a problem. United have already made a number of moves this summer, but the transfer window remains open, and the next several days are likely to determine whether the club secures the left back reinforcement it currently lacks. How this specific situation is resolved will also serve as an indicator of the club's broader recruitment strategy for the rest of the window, whether United is prepared to move decisively on available targets or whether it continues waiting on preferred names even when those names are publicly declared unavailable. To summarize where things stand, Lewis Hall remains a Manchester United target, but Newcastle have rejected an initial inquiry and have stated he is not for sale this summer. In response, United are reportedly willing to activate Jorge Salinas' release clause at Racing Santander, while also holding interest in Antonee Robinson from Fulham. Separately, Arsenal have reportedly agreed a $75 million deal for Bruno Guimaraes, a transfer that could strengthen Newcastle's financial position and make selling Hall even less likely. And in a development away from Manchester United entirely, Vinicius Jr has committed his future to Real Madrid until 2032, closing off what would have been one of Arsenal's biggest attacking targets of the summer. For Manchester United supporters, the central question now is whether the club continues pursuing Hall in the hopes that Newcastle's circumstances eventually change, or whether